Number 10, the king of hobbies. Everyone has their interests, right? Like for example, I like video games, and I like watching people scream at their teammates for not helping everyone else out. I'm looking at you, Blake. For kings back in the day, they didn't have people on Rocket League to scream at, so they had to find other interests. For Tsar Peter the Great, he had a lot of interests, and they were all very bizarre. Firstly, he had an obsession with short people, especially dwarves. To him, they were like his real-life dolls or something, and he would hold weddings for them and even hold lavish funerals, complete with small horses pulling a small coffin on a carriage, and even a very short priest to hold the ceremony. But other than this obsession with short people, he also dabbled a bit in medicine. He liked watching surgeries be performed like he was trying to be on Grey's Anatomy or something, but when watching the surgeries just wasn't enough for him, he would sometimes perform them himself. Now remember, he's not a doctor, so it's no surprise to learn that these surgeries rarely ever went well and people died. I certainly wouldn't trust him to give me any kind of surgery, but he was a king so he could do whatever he wanted. Peter the Great also loved dentistry. It is said that if you wanted to get all buddy-buddy with the king, all you had to do was let him pull your tooth. Sounds like the guy was one heartbreak away from starting his own medical drama, but in the worst way.
Number 9. Banning coffee. This is the worst of the worst, people. Murad IV, Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. The guy banned coffee like an absolute monster. No more triples for you. He was born in 1612, and for the most part, his mother was ruling through him because he was so young. That's often the case with most of these young rulers. They just get, hey, you're 7, now you rule a kingdom, enjoy. It's tough, they're not gonna know what's going on. But when he got a little bit older, he put forth these laws, punishable by death, might I add, in order to get things back on track. That was the key. He banned coffee, tobacco, and alcohol. He would actually disguise himself as a civilian during the nighttime and would wander around aimlessly in hopes that he would find one of these dark roast renegades. If you were caught outside having a quick smoke break, you weren't arrested, you didn't get fined, but rather Murad IV himself would take your head off right there in the streets. No trial, no jury, just straight to execution. All because you're drinking a Bud Light Lime.
At number 8, why you mad? Now this could be a bit of a controversial opinion, but if your name includes the words the mad, I would assume that you're not doing too great, right? I mean, you have to earn that title, and if it's a title that harsh, that simply begs the question, what in the HE double hockey sticks did you do to get that name? Well, for Charles the Mad, he did a lot. Charles became king when he was only 11 years old, so that certainly didn't help his development, and knowing this kind of helps explain a lot of his actions. He was known for getting really angry and throwing fits of rage, and was known to give people the gift of the big sleep, if you know what I mean. Charles didn't always kill people though, only sometimes. Other times he liked to switch things up. Sometimes he would run around his palace pretending to be a wolf. Other times he would go through phases where he just really didn't want to keep up with his personal hygiene, and he would get so gross that he literally had to be cut out of his own clothes. Now I don't know how long you have to go without bathing to get to that point, but really I don't think I want to know the answer to that question. Charles also thought that he was made of glass, and so he would go through phases where he would sit completely still so that he didn't break. Kind of like Drax from Guardians of the Galaxy, but not as, extraterrestrial. Well, maybe he was. That honestly would explain a lot.
Number 7 sparked a war. The history of North America is basically steeped in France and England, stomping over indigenous territory, playing in a game of tug-of-war, all while dealing with slavery. We're gonna get to all that later. However, Washington, being part of the Virginia militia, was a part of this. He was sent to the Ohio Valley with 10 troops to repel attacks from the French, but may have actually started a war. They had a small indigenous tribe ally with them, and they warned him that the French had a small force set up several miles away. They were supposed to be going to talk to them, but no one knows who fired the first shot, but a skirmish broke out. 10 French soldiers were killed plus 1 Virginian man, but the most notable death was that of Joseph Coulon de Villiers. He was a noble on a diplomatic mission, and his death enraged the French. They were like, we are so angry. Because of this, très fâché. Because of this event, the conflict between Britain and France escalated into the French and Indian War. This soon spread into what would soon be known as the 7 Years' War.
At number 6, love game. A lot of kings and queens throughout history have been known to engage in the horizontal hustle a lot. I mean, when you're a ruler of a kingdom, you don't really have much to do in your spare time, so what else are you gonna do? Play a board game? No. These monarchs were getting busy all the time, but there was one king who was just so obsessed with getting a good old pickle tickle that it just became his whole personality. King Philip V was known to be a nymphomaniac, and he liked doing the deed a lot, but because at the time, the Catholic Church said that having sexy time with anyone but your spouse was a sin, the king and his wife were getting busy all the time. Eventually, his first wife caught on to how to use this to her advantage, and she would often refuse to sleep with him until she got her way with anything she suggested or demanded from him. You would think that he would catch on to this game, but maybe his urges were just so strong because he always caved and gave her what he wanted. Obviously, this man did not follow Hoodville. Absolutely not. Just to give you guys an idea of how obsessed this guy was, when his wife was on her deathbed, before she went he literally tried to get one last bang in. On her deathbed. Like, dude, not the time.
Number 5, George V. We love hobbies here on Bumblebee. I mean, I used to collect special quarters growing up. I swear to God. The only time I've ever been good at saving money was when I was 12. I would see one of these and be like, don't touch it. George V turned out he loved stamps. A lot. Like a lot. Since he was a wee young lad, he was collecting these little guys. Here's the unusually impressive part about him though and his hobby. He continued to collect stamps during World War I. This guy was busy, everybody's trying to stay alive, and George is just licking stamps in the library like a prince. Like all collections, it started at an early age and now it's at the point where it's past impressive and it's just borderline strange. This guy had albums on albums of stamps. He had around 330 albums, each with 60 pages full of stamps. Quick maths, that's like 20,000 pages full of stamps. So naturally he was nicknamed the King of Stamps, or rather the King of Philately, the official term for collecting stamps. It's a nice word. Philately. Philately. Back in 1905, he set an all-time stamp record, which I didn't even know that was the thing, and it was the most money ever spent on a single stamp. The guy dropped like 220,000 US on a single stamp. Somebody even asked the prince down the road if he had heard about this idiot who spent 1,400 pounds on a stamp, and he was proud of it. He was like, that was me, you wanna see it? The next King George is a little different, to say the least.
At number 4, womanizer. I'm going to preface this by saying that George IV of England was voted as England's worst king by historians, so that should already tell you a lot about this guy. Georgie here was yet another one of those monarchs who was a little too invested in his intimate conquests, you know? Now we do know that the encounters that he was on were all consensual, so that's a plus. However, he was still creepy about it. Yeah. This man tried everything to get a woman to sleep with him. He would throw a tantrum if she said no, or threaten to end his life if he didn't get to do the 8-legged nature dance, you know? Somehow, this had a pretty good success rate, even though he was not a catch at all. It feels like this was one of those situations where you kind of just give in to make him stop talking, you know? Anyways, this guy was super creepy because on top of the lengths that he would go to just to get some time in the sack, he also kept trophies of his conquests. He would ask each of the people he slept with for a lock of their hair, and he kept them all. Back then, it was kind of common for lovers to keep locks of each other's hair, but George's collection was alarming because of just how many locks of hair there were. After the king died, his brothers found 7,000 envelopes, each with a lock of hair that was, quote, enough to stuff a sofa, end quote. Fun fact, if you want to see this insane collection, it is in a museum in Scotland, so check that out if you want, I guess.
Number 3, Kleptomania Part 2. On our spoiled queens list, Brie mentioned Queen Mary and how she just couldn't stop stealing, which is hilarious to me, just this old lady stealing your shit. Well, the last king of Egypt also had sticky fingers. He was even better at it too. Check this out. Farouk I was the youngest son of Egypt's first king, Fuad I. Now born in 1920 in Alexandria, and in his early days at school, he couldn't concentrate. The king sent him to England even after to hopefully find a better way of teaching, something that works for him, but still it was to no avail. Once the king passed away in 1936, Farouk then got the throne, but also so much property and so much money. He had hundreds of fancy cars, 75,000 acres of land. This guy had it all. Literally, he had anything he could think of, but still he felt like he needed to take more, to steal. At 17 years old, he would slam 12 eggs for breakfast and then wash it down with 30 bottles of beer. Nutritious and delicious. Horrible. On top of the fact that he loved to steal, he was the biggest hoarder. So he had thousands of shirts, randomly. He also had 50 diamond-studded walking sticks for some reason, and like a prince such as myself, he too collected coins. I mean, his collection was much nicer, but still, great minds think alike. Spoiled minds think alike, rather. Oh shit, this is eye-opening. One of the most bizarre facts about Farouk was he pickpocketed Winston Churchill once. He took the guy's watch. After everything I just said, he still decided to steal his watch. What a gem. We love him. Yeah.
At number 2, the King of Pettiness. Let's talk about a ruler that the Indian state of Alwar has described as controversial. If his own people are calling him controversial, then you know something's up, and boy, you better strap in because you're in for a wild ride with this one. Maharaja Jai Singh was pretty eccentric in a pretty dark way. He was known to have a temper and act on impulse, and he did some very questionable and downright scary things. He was known to be very competitive and hated to lose. One time while playing polo, he and his team lost, and so in retaliation he blamed the horse he was using and made the horse get extra crispy. He fired his horse. I'm sure you know where I'm going with that. If not, use your noodle, I don't know. Unfortunately, the cruelty towards living things didn't stop at animals, and he was also known to kidnap women from the streets and go all criminal minds on them. On a slightly lighter note, though, the Maharaja was also known to be very petty. Once he went into a Rolls-Royce dealership, and the person working there thought that he was broke and ignored him. Thinking that this was insanely rude, he bought 7 Rolls-Royces, sent them back to India, and used them to pick up garbage. This guy was really just doing the absolute most.
And coming in at our number 1 spot, King Ludwig II. Home renovation shows rock my world. I can watch, love it, or list it for months at a time. It's the dream, building your own home one day, and if you're a king, well, it's pretty easy to get that done. In our Spoiled Queens Part 2, I mentioned a princess that had a house made of ice, literal ice. Well, King Ludwig II had numerous castles built to resemble fairy tales. Literally, like fairy tales. I gotta admit, I kind of love this a lot. Ludwig was only 18 when he became the King of Bavaria in 1864, and then he had castles, like castles, more than one, built after he was inspired from romantic literature and spending some time at the opera. The kid was a dreamer, you gotta love it. He would spend his nights in one castle looking through a telescope at his new castle being built, so he would just watch it all night. That's like the king's way of waiting for your Amazon delivery. Just standing there, just like, oh, it's coming. 17 years and it's done. Just 4 years in, he designed his own castle, and to this day, it's one of the most photographed places in the world. Neuschwanstein Castle. Go check it out. It's literally a paradise.
Number 10, starting off strong with a mule breeder. Out of all the things I thought I'd learn about this dude, this was not one of them. A mule breeder. George Washington loved animals. I like that. A mule is a cross between a horse and a donkey, and they are particularly important for American farmers, and so Washington made it a priority. He is believed to be responsible for creating the mule stock that supported the agricultural community in the South. But he didn't stop there, oh no. Washington loved dogs, including Dalmatians, foxhounds, French hounds, greyhounds, Italian greyhounds, mastiffs, Newfoundlands, pointers, spaniels, and terriers. There's a lot. Lions, tigers, and bear, oh my. A huge dog lover, he bred hunting dogs for speed over the years and gave them cute names like Sweet Lips, Venus, True Love, Taster, Tippler, Drunkard, and Madame Moose. Weird, okay? Those are some names. Number 9, and on the complete opposite side of that, we have the Spy Master. Funny enough, Washington actually wasn't keen on becoming president, and he hated being general. But the one thing he was really good at and actually kind of partly enjoyed doing was being spy master. The Revolutionary War was ill-equipped, being perpetually undermanned and undertrained and undersupplied, so Washington had to think in another way to win, so he developed a secret intelligence network. Washington had a whole ring of spies that were so good even he didn't know who they all were. They utilized invisible ink to communicate letters, they used anonymous female spies such as the infamous Agent 355, an African-American double agent, a Patriot tailor who spied while making clothes for British officers, and then just so many. He was more deeply involved in the spy ring than any other American general-in-chief except for Dwight Eisenhower, who got really involved in World War II, but up until that point, it was just this guy. Number 8, Fairfax. We all have a first love. Some of us are lucky enough to still be with them, others are lucky enough to find someone even better. Hopefully, this was the case when he found Martha, but his first love was one Sally Fairfax. At 27 years old, Washington had just become engaged to Martha, but that September he wrote a romantic letter to Sally. He goes on to call himself a devotee and describe thousands of tender passages between them. He speaks of destiny that divides him and her from being together, but here is the catch. Sally was the wife of one of his best friends, George William Fairfax. If that wasn't enough to keep them apart, George was about to be married, so it had to be quits. The letter itself doesn't actually openly declare love per se, but something steamy is hidden behind metaphors. We often picture Washington as the white-haired old guy on money, but at one time the dude was young, robust, and clearly love-struck.
Number 7. Party hard. Zhu Huzhou was the emperor of the Ming Dynasty in the early 1500s. Now lately we've been talking about kings and queens, we're on part 2s for both now, and there's a good amount who simply just aren't ready, they're too young to rule. Like Joffrey from Game of Thrones. Kings like that actually existed, they were horrible. They were young, they were too young to know what was right and wrong. Plus they usually have some corrupt parents whispering in their ears the entire time. Zhu took the throne at just age 14, and for a while, ministers were confident that he would grow into the role and become the leader that he was born to be. Well, when he got older, he transformed a zoo just outside of Beijing, he transformed it into his own personal brothel. Yum. I mean, on one hand, I'm glad the animals are free, but like, a zoo? You couldn't find a more romantic place? Can convert an Applebee's to a brothel, maybe? I don't know, something with AC? His final days were spent partying, and some would say a little bit too hard. He got intoxicated and fell from a boat. That's how he ended his life. Honestly, not a bad way to go out. Pretty OG.
Number 6. Indigenous relations. We kind of spoke about that earlier, but here we go, we're gonna go more in depth. Despite years and years of having to endure the BS that the Europeans put them through, like smallpox, I don't know, stealing their territory, all that stuff, you know the drill, somehow they were able to create pockets of allies with Native Americans. I don't know how. Throughout his life, Washington negotiated with Native Americans, served alongside them, fought against them, and sought their lands. Like literally a walking contradiction all the time. It just looks like he just kind of did what he needed to do regardless, and just as long as it got him where he wanted to go. He respected their war tactics and even implemented some of them during the Revolutionary War. But then he would turn on them again. As commander-in-chief, he instructed armed forces to attack native nations allied with the British or those who resisted the expansion. When he became president, he followed the movement that wanted Native Americans to assimilate to their Western ideas. He just... What the heck was it, man? You could fight beside them, but you couldn't respect them? I don't understand this. Number 5. Dentures. By 1789, because of health and happenstance, Washington had only one tooth left in his mouth that was his. Most of his food had to be softened and chopped up into little pieces so he could eat it. It was also why he didn't smile. But the man was fitted with some of the earliest dentures, and they were not comfy. In fact, they caused further disfigurement later on in his life. One of the most ridiculous and most famous rumors surrounding George Washington's dentures was that he had wooden teeth. For a long time the rumor was that they were made from the wood of the cherry tree he cut down, but that wasn't true. Though the truth isn't much better. They actually came from ivory and real human teeth pulled from the mouths of the poor and possibly his very own slaves. I will expand on that later, stay tuned. There isn't precise proof that this indeed is the truth, but there is one marking in his ledger that shows the purchase of teeth from one of his slaves. So whether those teeth are actually from, like, for his dentures, we don't know, but what else would they be for? I'm glad he purchased them at least. I don't know, that's just weird to me, man. Number 4. At 11. Washington started young. He might have been one of the founding fathers of the USA, but his history does not stand away from injustice of the time. Before he could even make a choice about it, Washington inherited slaves at the age of 11 after his father Augustine died in 1743. In his will, he left his son a 280-acre farm in Fredericksburg, Virginia. Attached to that estate were 10 enslaved people, and Washington purchased at least 8 more. This included a carpenter by the name of Kit, and by 1755 he had purchased 4 men, 2 women, and a child. By 1799, over 317 enslaved people were living at Mount Vernon, with 123 people being owned by Washington himself. His wife Martha also received enslaved people from her late first husband, and over the century and by the end of the American Revolution, the percentage of enslaved people rose from 28% to 40% because of their union. Number 3. Speaking of slaves, we have Harry. If George was such a benevolent master, then why did his slaves want to leave? Answer is simple, because people are not objects and can't and shouldn't be owned. Harry was one of Washington's slaves and would gain popularity when he escaped Washington upwards of twice. The first time, Washington paid £1 and 3 shillings to, and I quote, advertise for the recovery of his property. Though Washington was later for the abolitionist movement, he was a shrewd businessman and knew that should his slaves be freed, the Virginia economy would be in peril, so he fought as hard as he could to keep them as long as he could. On November 14th, 1775, John Murray declared any slaves will be freed if they were willing to bear arms to the British crown. Harry ran like hell, as did many others. This time Washington hired a slave catcher who managed to return 7 of what he determined was his property, but not Harry. He was currently serving as a corporal in the Dunmore's all-black loyalist regiment. He managed to evade him after the war, but life continued to be unkind to Harry and his wife. White settlers in Nova Scotia underpaid them and conditions were terrible. His tale sadly goes cold after he started a rebellion that got him banished at age 60 in Sierra Leone. Number 2, which brings us to it's complicated and awful. So as we know from the above, Washington owned a lot of slaves and it was really complicated. If Washington fought with the abolitionist movement and wanted slaves to be free, why did he have so many? By law, Martha nor George could set these people free. However, George put it in his will to ensure that every slave he owned be freed after his passing. Martha, his wife, made sure this happened, though it took a long time. It took until like 801 for everyone to be emancipated. However, despite this, his treatment of his slaves is still questionable. Visitors to Mount Vernon left behind conflicting accounts of Washington's treatment of his slaves. He frequently whipped and enforced hard labor, even forcing them to work 24 hours. On New Year's Day in 1789, he requested that his people work as soon as it was light and work until it was dark. He heavily relied on his people to work his Virginia plantation so that he could run a profit. In fact, this was the nature of the South, and Washington, being a businessman, knew that if slaves were freed, the economy would soon snowball. So, like I said, pretty complicated and really awful. Was he for or against slavery regardless of public opinion? If he had been given the choice to buy slaves, would he have? Who knows? But I think we can all agree that the fact that he owned and worked slaves is pretty messed up. People aren't property. And last but not least, his death. George Washington was terrified of being buried alive and ordered that his body not be touched until 3 days after his death, just in case. Throughout his life, he survived multiple near-death experiences, from diphtheria, tuberculosis, smallpox, malaria, dysentery, quinsy, carbuncle, and pneumonia. This man wasn't about to die easily. He even survived near drowning in ice and the burning and massacre of Fort Necessity. But in the end, it was a cold, something that today could have easily been fixed with some antibiotics. But instead, his doctors are really what did it. They essentially nursed him to death. They bloodletted him, removing around 40% of his own blood, for example. They even burned him. They made him gargle vinegar and molasses, which caused him to choke. It was a lot. It was actually this treatment that had the 1,000-year-old tradition of bloodletting finally called into question.
Number 10, Richard Nixon. I just want the American people to know that I've never profited off the people. I've earned every cent, and I am not a crook. Anyway, said Richard Nixon, who might quite possibly be a crook. He probably was. Nixon was the 37th President of the United States of America and had a lot on his plate. China, the Soviet Union, the Middle East, that little tiny war that no one's worried about ever called the Vietnam War. A little tiny one, not a big deal at all, totally not. Oh man, with all that, you just might forget to take bribes from the mafia-backed Teamsters and to the whole Watergate scandal. Ooh. Look, every president has their secrets, and corruption is just part of the plan. After the Watergate scandal on August 9, 1974, Nixon resigned, which was the right thing to do, but if he didn't, well, he was most likely going to be impeached and he most likely was going to be removed from office. It was going to go all the way, so. Number 9, Manuel Noriega. Most Americans will recall a time in the 1980s when Central America was a point of concentration for American agencies. A big juicy piece of American history, and a place that saw it all was Panama. And its de facto leader, Manuel Noriega. Central America had been a target for the US for some time as communism was beginning to spread down in those gorgeous weather countries, which is a no-no, we don't want that. Manuel himself had been an asset to CIA intelligence for years, and during all the spying on the Reds and overthrowing Contra groups, well, it got a little out of hand. However, Manuel wasn't stupid, and during his time working with the CIA, he had amassed a large fortune, especially after it was discovered he was also aiding those, white powder smugglers in their efforts. You know what I'm talking about. This would result in an American invasion in Panama and his duly arrest. Number 8, cashback. King George III had a simple ask of the American colonies. Right then, we just saved you all from the French and Indians, so now it's time to do the right thing and pick up the bill. Britain introduced new taxes on the colonies in order to pay back what it had spent on the previous war. But in reality, he was asking the colonies to pay up without much in return. Basically, I'm the king, I saved your skins, give me more money, which most people at the time couldn't afford. And I'm still gonna boss you around. The British Empire may have been victorious, but it was the colonists who felt all the effects of the war and the economy. This happened multiple times before some patriots had had enough and decided to act. And what he did when the people he was forcing to give money spilt a little tea? Well, he sent British troops for a semi-friendly military occupation. I'd hate to loan this guy a nickel. Number 7. Jimmy Hoffa. Have you folks ever been to Las Vegas? Ever wondered how such an amazing city could be built in the desert? A place where there's blackjack and ladies of the evening, as a futuristic robot would say. Honestly, when I go on my first vacation, it's probably gonna be Las Vegas. It's just my kind of town. I love that kind of stuff. So does Chris. We like that. We like buffets and blackjack and yeah, ladies. Nice. Nice. Very nice. Well, back in the 1950s, Las Vegas wasn't a town of corporate-owned family casinos and resorts. Back then, it was all mafia. It's just how it goes. Basically, you get a loan from a corrupt Teamsters union, with a vig of course, fill it with swanky stuff, book the Hollywood elite like Frank Sinatra or my favorite, Don Rickles, and you got yourself a casino and resort. All of this thanks to Jimmy Hoffa, who was the leader of the Teamsters Union, who would loan out Teamster cash to known criminals so they could make their fortune in Las Vegas. Which, in case you didn't know, is fraud and extremely corrupt. And very dishonest, especially for a man that claims to be very honest. It wasn't a good look, it was bad. Number 6. Uri Geller. Today this name doesn't mean very much, but back in the day it actually meant quite a lot. Uri Geller is a self-proclaimed psychic who possesses psychic abilities. During his peak fame had convinced people of his psychic powers. Spoiler alert, he doesn't have any. His powers are more along the lines of a birthday party magician. Now, there's nothing wrong with magic or illusions. I actually enjoy them quite a lot. I think it's fun and interesting showmanship. I love magicians, they're cool. However, Uri doesn't sell it like that. And that's the issue, really, is that he's selling it. Telling people that they can have his psychic powers too, like psychokinesis and telepathy. All you need to do is buy this book for $49.99. Best value though. Even though he's been debunked and proven wrong on separate occasions, including on television, which is just insane. Seriously, look that guy up, it's crazy. He's been debunked like 5 times. Number 5, Pablo Escobar. Imagine being born in a poor country, one of the poorest, and after a few short years, being the richest man on the planet. At least cash-wise. Pablo Escobar was a smuggler from Colombia and during the 1980s rose to absolute fame and infamy. Starting out as smuggling your standard illicit cargo like valuable electronics, goods, and upgrading to whatever Macho Man Randy Savage was on during the entirety of his career. You know what I'm talking about. Oh yeah! I need someone to know Sugar Hulkamania, brother! Strangely enough, with all his wealth, he tried to take his claim and run for office in Colombia, which didn't work out because they knew who he was. He can give his money out to the people all he wants, but the dude had quite the rap sheet. Probably one of the biggest. Number 4, Al Capone. Al Capone is the textbook definition of corrupt. And sure, he isn't the leader in the normal sense, but a lot of people looked up to him. However, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about all the people he made corrupt. Cops, lawyers, and even judges. There was a lot, it's kind of alarming actually. All were warming up to him and old Scarface because their pockets were deep. And if you didn't take the money, well, you could end up getting hurt pretty bad actually. Capone may be gone, but Chicago to this day remains one of the most corrupt cities in America. That was actually ranked number 1 corrupt city in America 3 times in a row. That's crazy. Illinois being the 3rd most corrupt state, so there you go. Number 3, Frank Rosenthal. Okay, back to Las Vegas and the casinos. Frank Rosenthal. He was an American sports betting genius and perhaps maybe had connections to the Las Vegas mob. But I ain't saying nothing. Well, Rosenthal was such a good earner, as I've been told, that he was put in charge of his very own casino. Now, anyone who's ever worked in the casino industry or lottery will tell you that the rules are very strict. There's no fooling around with state law. The counting room, for example, only gives access to certain people. Not even the owner sometimes can go in. Well, under Rosenthal, sometimes a few $100,000 would go missing from time to time in a skim operation. Casino managers are supposed to be squeaky clean. Rosenthal was anything but. Number 2, Joseph Stalin. Today, most young people know the Gulag as the place you go when you really suck at Call of Duty Warzone. And let me tell you, I spent my fair share in there, brother. I'll spend my fair share in there, brother. However, for people living under Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union, this was not a fun FPS to play with friends. Gulags were awful, wretched Soviet prisons where all the peoples he deemed a threat to greater communism were sent to most likely work themselves into their graves, and they did. Millions of people suffered under his reign, and he's remembered only for his brutality and history's second best mustache. It's a pretty good one. It's more like Mario's, but anyway. Number 1, angry German boy. Angry German guy. German, you know what I'm talking about. You all know him, you all should hate him, really you should. It's the failed art student turned totalitarian autocrat. Mustache Man thought he was bringing home a better Germany, but he was actually dooming it. After his time spent in the First World War, he was tasked by the government to spy on some other groups who were suspected of being evil communists. Wasn't a lot of love for them back then. He ended up finding the National Socialist Party, where he quickly rose to be their leader. And then some brown shirts were made, and then some glass was broken, and then some good folks got hurt, and then your grandpa got, just a big mess, big mess. Number 10, what a drag. Bachelor number 1. What would you do if I refused to marry you? Well, I would probably get quite violent and lead to the destruction of 10,000 lives at the Battle of Hastings. Might just drag you around by your hair and see where the night goes. William I, or more appropriate, William the Conqueror, was a fierce warrior and the first Norman king of England. Being the illegitimate child he was to the throne, some people didn't exactly respect the power moves old Willie was making. People rebelled, and he crushed them. Oh, and there was this one time that he fancied a woman named Matilda. Being the respected woman that she was, she declined Willie's advances. Willie, not taking no for an answer, promptly dragged her around by the hair until she agreed to marry him. Gee, what a swell guy. Number 9, let them eat cake. France had seen better days in the 1790s. People were starving, the economy was bust, and for some reason the poorest citizens were being taxed the most. When cries were made from the people, they demanded that change be made. King Louis XVI, being the great leader he was, he listened to the people and there was no problem ever again. Oh wait, he did nothing and the country had a bloody revolution. The man supposed to be leading his people failed to act. In fact, he did less than nothing, often trying to silence the riots by force. But when people are very hungry, and you're living fat with high society, you can lose your head in all that chaos. While the famous quote, "let them eat cake," may not have actually been said, it's a good reminder of the disconnect between the upper class and poor. Leaving your people to starve isn't the best idea if you want to be a king for a long time. Number 8, JFK. For the most part, this man was great. A president that is fondly remembered by a lot of people in the US. However, the man was not without controversy. First off, the Kennedy family wealth has its ties to La Cosa Nostra, as JFK Sr. made his fortune bootlegging in the 20s. Hey, you gotta make your money somehow. Add to this that JFK's vote numbers may or may not have been tampered with, and well, it's bad luck for democracy. Starting the Vietnam War, having an affair with his wife, and well, it's also rumored that he may also have more mob connections. Not so much him being the gangster, but more like along the lines of, hey, we did you a favor kind of thing, don't forget it kind of thing, or somebody could get hurt kind of thing. You know what I'm saying? Number 7, Terrible Ivan. He wasn't called Ivan the Very Friendly and Generous and would for sure never cause any harm to anyone ever. He was Ivan the Terrible, and for good reason. His actions are very unholy. Let's start with the fact that he killed his son's pregnant wife. And when his son came to confront dear old dad, his son was struck with a pointed staff, killing him in a fit of rage. A legend tells us that once St. Basil's Cathedral was finished construction, he was so pleased with the architect, to reward him for such magnificent work, Ivan gouged his eyes out so that no one would ever design something so beautiful again. His paranoia also caused the slaughter of Novgorod, where after he was done claiming thousands of lives, he burned all the fields just for good measure. Wouldn't want all those dead people farming without your permission. Should we tell him about the other world monuments? Number 6. Off with her head! Henry VIII is more well known for how he treated his wives more than his leadership. With a reign of over 20 years, the man had a few wives. 2 of his wives were executed for ridiculous reasons, another was divorced. Turns out, actually, the church wouldn't grant that divorce he was looking for. So Henry went and did the next best thing. He broke away from the Catholic Church and dissolved the monasteries, taking their wealth and redistributing it as he saw fit. Nothing is unholier than trying to get away from the church. Historians believe that his divorce actually led to the English Reformation. Number 5. Nothing left. Alexander the Great was an excellent warrior for his time. Having conquered so much at a young age is really quite impressive. His empire stretched from Greece all the way to India. For a history class or a good book, this is fine, but in reality, he was a conqueror. The places he was marching into weren't exactly happy to have spear-wielding visitors. He laid siege on multiple cities, executed those who defied him, and sold people into YouTube's least favorite S-word. Just about checks off everything a guy needs to be considered a tyrant. History remembers his conquest, but I for sure will not forget how brutal conquerors can really be. Number 4. Chop Chop. While Maximilien Robespierre was not a king in the monarch sense, he did hold a lot of political power in France when the political climate was quite messy. Plus, France was at war. But even messier than that is the way he dealt with citizens who were deemed anti-revolution, by sending them to the guillotine. Within a 1-year period, he sent 17,000 people to their dooms via the National Razor, or as it became to be known. He even began practicing deism, something he called the cult of the supreme being. And if you know your history, you know that you can't get away with that forever. And with some sweet poetic justice, Robespierre was sentenced to the guillotine. Number 3. All my friends are dead. Usually when people expire, the human thing to do is bury said lifeless human. It's just what we do. But apparently Ferdinand I of Naples did not get that memo, instead taking a page from Night at the Museum. No, this is not a cute comedy movie starring Ben Stiller, but in reality a complete horrifying nightmare. Ferdinand took the saying, "keep your enemies close," a little too literally, as his favorite form of punishment was to mummify his enemies, which, let's face it, if he's a king, there's gonna be plenty. And he would like to display these mummies in what's probably the coolest place to be if you're into that weird goth stuff. He did keep some alive in the dungeon, but he much preferred his guests embalmed, where he would have them dressed up on display, just as they were before making the mistake of crossing Ferdinand. Now, what's the point of having that hardcore collection if you're not going to show it off? Well, he did. To the people he suspected of treason, which, in a place like that, treason leaves your mind pretty quick. Number 2. Average height for the time. Napoleon Bonaparte was one of the greatest military strategists of his time, maybe of all time. With full support of the French army, Napoleon found himself earning gallant victories one after another, all being accomplished at a very young age. However, after years of great success in multiple wars and kicking a lot of imperial butt, it started to go to his head. Shortly after the coup that overthrew Robespierre, Napoleon had gained enough support to claim himself as the Emperor of France. With said power, dissolved the freedom of press, reduced the rights of women, and oh yeah, he was at war with most of Europe for years to come. While his military victories cannot be understated, his rise as a tyrannical dictator makes him very unholy. Number 1. Dracula. There's been a lot of unholy things said here today, but old Vladdy takes the cake. What he lacked in land and power, he made up for in his brutality. As the legends go, Vlad was creative in his punishments, and was well noted for his human art pieces. And by art, I mean impaling his enemy on pikes, sometimes through their rear ends, and leaving them as warnings for anyone who dared cross him. Similar to the time visiting envoys wouldn't remove their hats as it is to do in tradition, so Vlad had their hats nailed to their skulls, so that they may never remove them. There are a few other stories that are just too hot for YouTube, but I think he's a textbook example of unholy. He may also be the inspiration for Dracula. Imagine being that much of a monster one is created in your likeness. I mean, just looking at the painting of this guy creeps me out, man. Whoa!